for now, I'm going to pass over to you, Claire, to talk about energy optimization, and looking forward to it.
Yeah, great. So I am going to dive in and take you through a little tiny step about energy optimization. So how I like to think of how we might optimize energy within our life, and maybe if you do any sort of sport or exercise within sport and exercise, um, we need to be thinking about three main things. So thinking about strategic nutrition, movement, and sleep. So what do I mean by strategic nutrition? Well, that is thinking about how we fuel our performance, how we fuel our success, how we might fuel our sport, but also thinking about how we might use the principles of working with a professional athlete and bringing that into a professional business person's life. So kind of creating the corporate athlete, if you like. So we're going to dive into a small part of this strategic nutrition today, because all of these steps work together. So they're all working in synergy together. So our sleep has an impact on how we eat, what we eat, why we eat what we eat. And our movement has an impact on sleep. Our sleep has an impact on movement, and movement it has an impact on nutrition, and vice versa. So they're all working in this synergistic way. So I look at energy optimization in 6 steps. And some of these steps are quite large steps. So today I'm going to pull out a little bit. So for those of you that have written down a little bit on your food diary, or perhaps if you haven't, if you want to, maybe if you can think about yesterday. And as I was saying before, for those that have just joined us, there is no perfect day. We are all human beings. And so if you think maybe like recall yesterday, think about maybe what you ate. So if you just want to scribble that down maybe now. And if you want to put any notes down there, like maybe you were really sort of tired and a bit slow in the morning, maybe you had that big sort of afternoon dip, or maybe you sort of came alive in the evening. So if you can put any notes down of what you could remember about sort of your energy levels, if you want to put a note down about your sleep, you might track it on like a wearable. But any little notes on there will be really useful for the next part that we're going to dive into. So part of step one is actually looking at data. So the small part of data we're going to look at today is you collecting data from your food diary. Step three, we look at how we might enhance all of our knowledge around nutrition and how all of those parts of that synergistic triangle work together. So today we're going to pull out a little bit about relearning our intuitive eating. So really looking at what I like to call appetite management. It would be great just to be able to manage it just like that as well, wouldn't it? So let's dive in a little bit about our food diary and where you think you might be right now. So if you've got that food diary in front of you, take a look at it. Or if you have just scribbled down some notes, that's absolutely fine. You might think of some more things as you're looking at it right now. So when you're looking at that, maybe have a look at like how many hours or maybe how many minutes were there between those meals that you were eating? In fact, are there meals, or is it like a constant graze that you might be having? Is it that maybe you are eating a really big breakfast and then you're so full you're not hungry until 3 o'clock in the afternoon? Maybe you can see a pattern on there around mid-afternoon where you're diving and scrabbling into that desk drawer to find that chocolate bar or that little packet of biscuits, or perhaps if you're at home, even a Stell biscuit at that point in time is just the most amazing thing that you've just found. So have a look and see what you're doing right now. Or perhaps it's that you're really trying to kind of, you wake up in the morning and you think, right, I am going to be different today. Today, I'm going to be on track with my nutrition. And actually, you end up eating not very much at the beginning of the day. But what happens in the evening is that where you see actually maybe a bit of grazing, a bit of snacking, a bit of overeating. So is there anything that anyone wants to maybe share? So I think you're all on mute. So if there's anything that you want to share about any sort of pattern that you see right now. So is there anything that anybody wants to tell me? It may not be about yesterday. It might be about another day. Since we're talking about it, you might suddenly have thought of something in terms of a pattern that you might see on a regular basis. So does anyone want to want to share at all?
Me,
Yeah, go for it.
yeah, my meal times are fairly regular and eat broadly the sort of same type of food. But I do find that different times in the day, depending on how the day's going, I get sugar cravings. Usually maybe around the middle of the morning or even maybe sometimes kind of mid late afternoon. And
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of maybe related to kind of work. So if things are really, really busy or I don't like the
Mm-hmm.
word pressure, but if there's a lot of stuff kind of going on, then I see me get into the kitchen in here and I try and restrict it to raisins and nuts and things like that, but I don't always manage to do that. So sugar cravings kick in, I would say a couple of times a day
Mm.
for me.
Interesting. And do you act on those sugar cravings or do you wait till the next meal? What happens?
I eat what I can find.
Yeah.
So that sometimes that's nuts and raisins and
Mm-hmm.
that gets me through. Then other times it can be maybe biscuit
Mm-hmm.
in the office if I can find them. So it's really just more what's available
Mm-hmm.
to me at that particular point. And I always finish the day with some chocolate.
And that's fine. And all of those things are really interesting, Ken. So thanks for sharing that because there are
It just
so many elements. There are so many elements to why we might feel this sugar craving, why we might act in the way that we do, and also, is that actually a metabolic reason, a real biological reason why we're feeling hunger, or is it appetite? Because they're two different things. And also, is it in response to something? So you talked about, a pressurized environment. Is it that we're actually responding in an emotional way, or is it actually that we haven't eaten enough, or maybe the right type of nutrients at our last meal? So there's so many layers to this, and actually looking at your pattern and collecting that data every so often. So if you're going to collect data, do something with it. There's no point in just having it there, right? So people love to collect things like MyFitnessPal, and my number one question is, great, this is like 3 years worth. I was given at one point by somebody who actually was in finance. He loved data, and he sent me, no joke, 3 years worth of a food diary. And I asked him, what has he done with that? And the answer was nothing. So if you're going to collect some data, do something with it. So even if you do this as a one-off, a one-off every so often, have a look at these patterns and maybe try and work out actually why is it I do what I do. Is there anybody else that wants to share maybe any patterns that they've seen at all?
I'll
Yeah,
share.
go.
I'll share yesterday's. So I, as Ian said, our diets are a bit rubbish at the moment, and I never really have time in the mornings to sort out my lunch. I'm always rushing around, so I ended up with a really random lunch. I don't tend to have breakfast because I'm too busy sorting everybody else out, and I never really feel hungry in the mornings.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, so my lunch consisted of, and it is really random, sourdough bread, some cold pork, and some apple sauce. So that was
Mm-hmm.
my lunch. I didn't snack in the morning. I didn't snack in the afternoon, but by the afternoon, sort of 4 o'clock, I was feeling really, my energy was really low and I just felt really tired. Until I then decided, right, I'm going to have a piece of coffee and walnut cake. And then totally, I was fine again, energy back up, and just my sort of, I suppose, mental that sense of my attitude to everything was just much more positive.
Mm.
And then that was fine until I had my dinner, which was a stir fry in the evening. But I don't tend to have breakfast, so I don't know if that is that. What do they say about? Because some people say you should have breakfast, other people say it's good not to have or to delay it. So yeah.
There's a lot of research behind, should we have breakfast, should we not have breakfast? And the answer, as a lot of my answers are, it depends. So there's
Okay.
multiple answers to that question. For some people, if you're not somebody who tends to overeat at the next meal, then if you're not doing any sort of sport, or it's not really important that you're having to use a lot of concentration first thing in the morning, it may not be as important for you to eat breakfast. But that certainly wouldn't be the case if you're going to go and give a big presentation, or maybe you're talking to people about your product. I would suggest that actually from a concentration point of view, that you actually do have something. And not everybody is hungry first thing in the morning. And there are reasons for that as well, because it depends again on a number of factors of what happened in the last 24 hours as well, because it's not just the here and now that we're talking about. We're actually looking back further than that as well. And it's really interesting what you said about the coffee and walnut cake actually picked you up. So is there perhaps a bit of a habituation there in terms of I'm so used to my energy levels being low that I don't think it affects me anymore, but actually it does, because when I have something that's so high in sugar that picks me up, I actually feel great again. So it might be worth thinking, actually, maybe when I don't feel like I want something to eat first thing in the morning, I wonder how much your concentration, your mental agility, your flexibility of thinking is actually changed. So today is kind of an introduction to this in terms of getting you to think about actually how much does it affect me? But breakfast for some people is really interesting in terms of, the people that tend to overeat at lunchtime or mid-morning are the people that I would say absolutely 100% have breakfast, because it's then not beneficial for you throughout the day. So there's a whole fasting part to that as well in terms of how long we fast for. But yeah, so interesting. So thank you. So moving on. So when we think about hunger and appetite, they are two different things, and people often use these interchangeably, but they actually are different. So appetite, really, if we think about appetite, you might have heard like many years ago saying, oh, that he has a healthy appetite, like that might be your grandparents that might have talked about that. And appetite actually means like wanting to eat. So it might be kind of social, it might be the fact that you see something really lovely, there's an appetite there, you're feeling like you want to eat because of thinking about food, seeing food, looking at the clock. Hunger is actually different. So hunger is a real physiological, cellular level, biological level need. So your body is showing you signs that actually, from a functioning point of view, it really needs to have some sort of energy intake to continue to actually feed the organs, which is, in starvation, your metabolic rate, your speed at which you're using energy slows down. And it slows down so that you're conserving energy so that all the energy can be given to all the major organs. And in severe cases of starvation, it actually doesn't give very much energy to the organs, it gives it all to the brain. So although, if we think about how much percentage of energy our brain uses, it's an absolutely huge percent. So for everybody that's sat here in front of me now, like in our job roles right now, we'll be using huge amounts of energy across the day. And if you can think about, or if you have children, or you can think about back to when you were at school, you used to come home from school and you were absolutely starving. Now, some of that is because we used to, dart rounds the cricket field or whatever it might be and run around a lot more than we do right now. And there's an element of growth there, but we're using our brains so much. So it's really important that we think about how we fuel that. So there's a physiological and biological reason why we're drawn to eat. There's an external environmental reason why we are drawn to eat. So we'll go into that, like what we see, what we hear, what we smell. And there's also that metabolic reason. So actually different types of foods will affect our feelings of satiety, so our feelings of fullness, and that drive to eat, or that drive to actually stop ourselves from eating as well. So what drives it? Well, there's multiple levels. So when we look at this biological or physiological level, we need to think of a number of things. So our body is in a constant feedback loop. So in the top right hand corner here, we've got our fat cells. So our fat cells, actually, when we eat, when our fat cells produce leptin, when it produces enough leptin, the feedback loop to our hypothalamus, which is over here. So in our brain, our hypothalamus is the main control point of appetite. When we've eaten enough, actually, and leptin is produced, and enough leptin is produced, it means that our signal is to stop eating, to stop that eating episode. And leptin and ghrelin are the two major hormones in terms of increasing our drive to want to eat and decreasing our drive to want to eat. And ghrelin, the way I always remember it is ghrelin meaning gremlin, meaning hungry. So ghrelin is produced in your stomach in response to no food or little food, and also from our small intestine. So we've got our stomach here, and sat underneath your small intestine is your sat underneath your stomach is your small intestine, and then your large intestine. And your small intestine is like the first part of your bowel, and that's where all of your absorption, apart from sodium, which is an electrolyte, apart from sodium and fluids, your small bowel is where all of the absorption goes on, apart from B12, which is at the bottom of the stomach here. So we've got the hormone that's being produced by fat cells with that feedback loop to our brain. So when we eat a meal and we've had enough, that feedback loop should tell us that we're full. And some people say that actually when I have a meal higher in fat, I feel greater satiety. Now that's not entirely true in terms of the effect it actually does have on us, but maybe it's that feedback loop from leptin. So ghrelin drives us to eat. So when we feel a little bit hungry, we feel that kind of rumbling in our stomach, maybe a little bit, that feedback loop starts. Actually, by the way, the grumbling in the stomach, we have no idea still whether that's anything connected to hunger at all. Have any of you here sat in a room maybe and you've looked at the clock and it's kind of near lunchtime, somebody else's stomach's grumble, and suddenly everybody in the room have got this kind of affinity, like a mirroring of each other's grumbling of our stomach. So I don't know if any of you experience that, but there's no understanding really why that should actually happen, because in starvation we don't tend to necessarily hear that. We then need to think about things like our liver, for example. So our liver senses all the little peptides, which are so our proteins are cut down into something called like the building blocks, like Lego, if you will. These are called amino acids. And when we digest proteins, so things like meat or fish or eggs, it gets broken down into these little building blocks and little chains before it gets broken down right into those little pieces of Lego, the single pieces. Chains of Lego or chains of these amino acids are called peptides. And our liver can sense this breakdown, these little peptides running around. And again, it sends via this big vein called the portal vein, it sends that back to our brain, up to the hypothalamus to say that we've eaten. We've then got lots of other little hormones sat down here. So these are all still being studied actually, in terms of there's so many things we don't know about appetite and drives to eat. But some of these are things like CCK as an example. They're all little hormones, they're little peptides. They all feed back in response to different types of food that we have, about whether we have had enough fuel in our system, or whether we are really hungry and need to eat. So some of our hunger doesn't necessarily come from just seeing things. It's biological, it's physiological, and there's a feedback loop to us. So we should be able to tell if we're hungry and need to eat, and indeed if we're full and we need to stop. But it's not quite as easy as that, is it? And that's the problem, because we're so used to being able to override that. Sorry, Ian, do you have a question?
Yeah, so when we're stupidly busy, which is most of the time, you can sometimes forget to eat.
Mm-hmm.
And you just go through the whole day and go, I can't believe we haven't eaten anything. You haven't felt hungry, you've just been. So I can go not days, but a whole day without eating, without worrying about eating, without needing to eat. And if I eat a normal meal in the evening, I'm fine. What does that come down to, Claire?
Ignoring signs. So I talked about like habituation, like basically the ignoring a feeling, it being absolutely normal to you. So if you're used to doing that, it's very easy to override these signals. And I often go back when I talk about more intuitive eating, which we haven't got time to really dip into either, but this is a part about how do we intuitively eat, how do we listen to our body. Essentially, you're ignoring your cues, and it's very easy for us to do that. So take as an example, you really need to go for a pee. You could ignore that for a time period, couldn't you? It's easy enough to do. When you look back at and if any of you've had children, or any of you been around more recently around toddlers or babies, actually even if you look at small animals, so if you look at puppies, for example, they are all built with such intuition around food and feeding. So there'll be points, if you have had children, or if you can think back to kind of being around children, there are times where they will cry, they will eat, they will sleep, they will stop eating or feeding when they've had enough. They absolutely listen to what their body needs. And there's also a time during growth where suddenly you're like, blooming hell, that child's eating huge amounts, and it might go on for days and days and days, and then suddenly they go back to normal. There may be a time where, and this is more where they've kicked up a fuss about something, they go to bed shouting and screaming, you're like, oh my God, I'm a really bad parent, I've sent them to bed and they haven't had anything to eat. In the morning, you might see them eating like a Weetabix, a banana and a piece of toast. You're like, I've never seen them eat that amount. but then they just carry on the rest of the day as normal. So intuitive eating is inbuilt. It's just we have the ability to ignore it, and unfortunately this is what happens, and this is what often drives our overeating and undereating, because we can absolutely do that. If you think about Christmas or going out for a nice meal, really easy to overeat. Do we get the sensation of being full? Absolutely. Can we still overeat? Yep. Because there's a drive to want to do it. So it's about listening a little bit more, because it would be interesting to know like how much your concentration actually is affected if you're not eating the whole of that time. There is a side to intermittent fasting which shows some interesting facts around that actually as well. Does that answer your question in a very roundabout way?
Absolutely.
And is it, sorry to ask another question, but is it true? So when that whatever it is that's released to say that we're no longer hungry, is it true that takes about 20 minutes to register? So you've got 20 minutes of eating after you're full before you really know that you're full.
So time is really, really important in terms of and it depends on the type of nutrients that you've eaten. So if something's high in fat versus high in carbohydrates versus high in protein, they all take longer to be digested. They all take longer to empty, what we call gastric emptying. So emptying, the speed at which it empties from the stomach. So all of these factors all come into play. So it entirely depends also on, for example, if you've done any sort of sport, the combination of those different nutrients within a meal as well, and also the fact we're human. So everything is going to be personalized to you, and that's where this part becomes really important, is learning actually how long does it take me to feel full. But you're absolutely right, and the quicker we eat, and what we do know is research shows us actually when we've studied people with type 2 diabetes and that are overweight, what we've seen is when people eat really quickly, they do eat more. And so in answer to your question, Charlie, there is a time period. How long it takes is individual and depends on what you have, but it would be around that sort of time period. Because if you think about all those physiological things that I've just shown you, there are so many feedback loops already happening there. And that's just on a physiological basis. That's not with us controlling up here, and Ian saying, actually, I'm not going to eat, even though he's not saying it, he's just can override it. There's so many factors, aren't there, for us to ignore things as well.
Brilliant, thank you.
So slowing down eating is really important. So the other thing that comes into this then is in like environmental factors. Like what other things get in the way of us really listening to our body? So whilst there's that kind of physiological drive or biological drive to eat, which we may or may not ignore or may listen to, then we've got these other things that kind of make the world really noisy, and the world of kind of listening to our hunger and our fullness a little bit more complicated. Who's looking up at the clock now if you haven't already eaten? It's 1 o'clock and going, oh, I'm really hungry. Now, that can be for a number of reasons, because again, our habit of like, if we've got times where we'd usually eat, like set times, we would be hungry because we think about it, is one of the reasons. So is it that we think we're hungry because of what the time says? Oh, it's 8 o'clock, I must have breakfast. Oh, it's 1 o'clock, I must have lunch. What happens if you take all of those clocks off? How can you listen to yourself? Do you know? And then there's things like ear hunger. So let's think about, actually, you'd see this in cats and dogs or horses really easily. Shake a bucket at a horse, it comes running. Again, with a dog, if you opened like anything that it sounds like it's, its meal being prepared, it would pick its ears up and want to have food. But we do the same. So if you hear something being opened, you could recognize the sound of that. So if for you what you really love are crisps, and you hear that packet being open, you might go, oh, I am a bit hungry actually. Yeah, I really fancy a little bit right now. Like, is it real, or is it the fact that there's an association of what I'd really love to taste? And that comes on to taste. So when we sometimes see food or we think about food, we might go, oh, that tastes really nice. Oh, I fancy that. I'm a bit hungry. So we start to get these associations with food and sight and sound and hearing and taste that complicate, actually, is that true hunger, or is that actually kind of appetite? Like, I could eat, I fancy that I want something, but do I physiologically actually really need it? And of course, boredom is another thing, isn't it? You know, boredom, but also emotions as well. So if we're bored, or maybe we're anxious, or we're stressed, all of those things can mean that we end up either overeating or in fact undereating. And actually, some people who are really anxious, because of the release of certain hormones, so in that fright and flight response, we release adrenaline, and we also release something called cortisol. Now, usually, if you're releasing adrenaline at that point in time when the pressure's really on, usually we wouldn't be hungry. But it's when that pressure comes off. So say you've done a really big call or a presentation to a client. At that point in the time, you're probably not thinking about food. But when you finish, that level of adrenaline comes down. And because you've been utilizing so much energy, and your blood glucose levels have been a lot higher, what happens is we then get a drop and we go, I'm absolutely starving. So for some people, there's differences in the actual physiological part of stress and anxiety, whether people go for food at that point in time as a comforting factor to help feel less anxious, or what they perceive as making them feel less anxious, or in fact it might be when you finish doing something or the anxiety drops that we then actually are driven to eat. And that whole area is absolutely another step. It's a whole area behind why we do what we do and intuitive eating. But it's really, really interesting. And of course, there's eye hunger as well, isn't there? So if I don't know, let's take a nice coffee shop. So this has got a number of things, hasn't it? Go into a lovely coffee shop, we smell coffee, the association with taste, the sound of like the coffee being made. Suddenly all we want is coffee. And actually you hear people say, I don't even like coffee, but I love the smell. It makes me want one, even though I don't actually drink coffee. But we go in and they say, do you want anything else? And you've just had breakfast and you look at this amazing array of cakes and you go, wow. Well, I wasn't going to, but that looks really nice. And suddenly I'm a little bit hungry. So that eye kind of hunger comes into it as well. And tiredness has a huge part in this. So when we're tired, what happens is that interaction of those two hormones I talked about. So one being leptin and one being ghrelin. Now remember, ghrelin, the gremlin, hungry. What happens is when we don't have enough sleep and we're out of balance, is that more ghrelin is actually released. So it makes us feel like we're more hungry. We also have really poor control of our blood sugar levels. So what tends to happen is we are driven towards wanting to eat more often. And I'm sure all of you know that actually, when we're really tired, let's take jet lag as an example. You eat, most of the time it makes no difference. And then you eat again because you go, I'm really lacking energy, I'll have something else. Actually, all you need to do is sleep because that's the one thing that's going to help us get better. And actually drinking is part of that as well. So we know that sleep really interferes. And there's a huge amount of studies on sleep and overnight workers and people who are flying a lot. And actually the long-term impacts of what that does in terms of from a metabolic risk, so from our heart health, cardiovascular health in particular, and also our blood glucose levels. And I talked about our smell and our nose hunger as well. So I mean, who's hungry right now just talking about it? Maybe Charlie isn't, because Charlie's just eaten. So that would be interesting to know.
But this is definitely right, isn't it? When you're tired, you end up craving food, but particularly sugary food. Mm-hmm. So if you, I mean, and actually Ken already said it, just before bed, a bit of chocolate. And actually I quite often have a piece of dark chocolate not long before bed. So yeah, that's definitely, I definitely realize that.
Yeah. And there's many reasons for that tiredness and that craving of it's the real old hypothalamus, old brain part of searching for something very sweet to be able to pick us up just in case we have to do something. And our brain runs mainly on glucose. So out of everything, it's going to want glucose. It can run off fats, it can run off ketones, the breakdown of fats, but it wants primarily, it will take glucose over anything else.
It's one of the reasons why Matthew Walker talks about the fact that if you want to lose weight, improve the quality or amount of your sleep, because you'll have less sugary cravings and you'll naturally
Yeah, and that's due to ghrelin, and it's also due to insulin and our insulin response as well. So we know that people who don't, and that's again, that comes into jet lag and travel and things as well. Yeah.
Sometimes, Claire, I'll have a cup of tea in the afternoon, and instantly, or within about 15 minutes, I go very pale and feel massively lightheaded. And it happens probably once in every 30 cups of tea in the afternoon. But all of a sudden, I say to my wife, "Do I look pale?" And she goes, "Wow." Then I just have to fill myself with sugar. But what?
But
yeah.
Well,
in a cup of tea that would spike that, and I instantly feel awful until I've eaten like a Mars bar or banana or something.
So this comes back to a number of different things. You wouldn't know without measuring it and collecting some data, but just from what you've told me already, if you're not eating the whole of this time up until whatever it is in the afternoon, you are going to have really low blood sugar levels. Although there's a habituation part there, you're used to it. When something then goes into your stomach, so if you've got milk, have you got milk in that tea?
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of a feedback loop going on, and now it's actually feeding back and saying there is not enough there. There's also a feeling of a sensation of like a volume in your stomach as well, and that feedback from that volume in your stomach. But I expect there's a real feedback loop happening in terms of now your body really picking up on low blood sugar levels. So I think there's an answer to your to that problem that you're talking about. Is actually, I think you need to be thinking about how can you sustain your energy levels throughout the day. But it's really easy to ignore. But you don't want to get to the point where they're so low, because when they're so low and you have something sugary, we get the peaks and troughs, which in itself have lots of problems as well. Sure. So there's one way to do this, and if you want a copy of this, if you there's a link at the end of this that you can drop us an email, and I will send this over to you. So there's this hunger and fullness scale and a little bit about those types of hunger as well. So one little thing that you can go away and do today, and you can have a look at your food diary if you've got it in front of you now. So when you think about before you've eaten, how hungry you might be, we don't want to be down here at 0 or 1. We actually want to be starting to eat at around about 3. So we want to be just hungry when we start eating, and it's really tight. We want to be finishing eating at around 7. Now, one way you can use this scale, and believe me, one of the easiest things to do is photograph it, have it on your phone, or maybe stick it up on a fridge, or if you're in an office, and keep using it, because you can't just dip into it. You have to constantly ask yourself to start off with. So before you eat, actually, how hungry am I? You start eating, you say, well, how full am I getting? And then once you get to a 7, you should be able to put down your cutlery and finish. Now, you might say, well, I could finish, but I want to continue, and that's okay. You can do that. But it's a really good way also of telling, like, if there's long gaps in the periods that you eat and then you're suddenly really hungry, or maybe you're really full until 2 o'clock in the afternoon, it's probably that we've overeaten, or maybe that we've overeaten, say, at the last meal. So if we're really full for kind of longer than 4 hours, probably that last meal was a little bit too great. Or if we're getting really hungry, and I know, Charlie, you said yesterday about doing some sport and being really hungry and having a second breakfast and still being hungry, you know, there's a number of layers to that. But is it that you actually didn't have maybe enough in terms of energy intake at that first meal after doing that training? So there could be a number of reasons. So what I want you to do after today, and it'd be really interesting to see if anybody has a go with this, is actually start to think about hunger and fullness. You can use this 1 to 10 scale. How hungry am I when I start to eat? Or maybe you get to a point, Ian, where it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon and suddenly it's huge in terms of hunger because we haven't eaten all day. So if you're getting down here and you're shaky and your blood sugar levels are really low, we would be down here on empty. And we don't want these big swings from 0 to 10. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yeah.
Does that make, I was always of the, well, not always, I think I've read different views along over the time, but does it mean that you are better off to have a meal, a snack, and then a meal, as opposed to, because there's a school of thought where you're actually just better to have no snacks at all and a bigger meal to give your digestive system a bit of a rest. But equally, that could mean that you're getting into the next meal feeling really hungry. So is it, do you think snacking is important to avoid that hunger getting higher, or is the gap a bit more important?
Well, as always, it depends. Okay, a really good question, and it absolutely does depend, because you're absolutely right. For our blood sugar levels to decrease, and certainly our blood fat levels take a lot longer to decrease, and that's why going to bed and having enough sleep and having enough fasted time overnight, hence the word break fast as breakfast, we want a long enough period overnight for those blood fat levels to come down. So we don't want to be grazing all day, because we never then give ourselves an opportunity for our blood sugar levels to come back down and for everything to reset itself. But two, we also want to be able to feel hunger and fullness. A lot of people that graze say, I'm never hungry, I'm never full. Well, no, you wouldn't be, because you can't listen to yourself. So, but if you do sport, also if you find yourself overeating, I believe that snacking is a good option, because number one, with sport, we shouldn't have long gaps and allowing our essentially our muscle to be broken down. So if you have a small snack with a tiny little bit of protein, so think of it as a little blip of protein in between meals when you feel hungry, then that would be beneficial. But the important part about this is react to hunger. So if you feel some hunger, then in between meals, it would be useful to have a little something that has a little bit of protein in. So that would be how I would work this. But you're absolutely right. We don't want huge periods of time, certainly during our waking hours when we need to be fresh, with long gaps in food. But we need a long enough gap overnight. And the problem is, a lot of people have got this massive extended eating. And actually, a huge piece of research was done that most people are eating for over 12 hours, 12 to 14 hours, with 60% of people have their biggest amount of food or energy intake at their evening meal. So it's a huge percentage of people. And from that, over half of their energy intake from the day was essentially all in the evening. So our body has no chance to be able to deal with that properly. So it's really important we therefore spread some of this out. Does that answer your question?
Brilliant, thank you.
Okay. I appreciate time, so I am just going to move forward a little bit. So we need to just think about our hunger signals properly. Like, what are our hunger signals? So Ian, you can probably see from this list some of those things that you might have felt. So you suddenly felt that real sort of extreme hunger, that dip in energy levels. You might even feel something like a headache. Concentration levels certainly are something that really dip. Things take you an awful long time to do, so you might be sat trying to do a task for over an hour. But some of those things also are about comfort or pleasure, eating with other people, looking at something, hearing something, smelling something as well. And procrastinacking, as one of my clients once called it, which I think is great, we probably all do. So people go and make another cup of tea or go and get a snack when they can't concentrate on what they're doing. So there's many things that cause us to feel hungry, cause us to eat, cause us to stop eating. But ultimately, what we want to do is avoid these big spikes and these crashes in our blood sugar levels. And it sounds easy, but it can be quite difficult to do. And the problem with this is, and Ian, you were talking about that chocolate. And if we've got a really low level of blood sugar levels throughout the whole of that morning, and your body, your brain, remember, is using glucose as a fuel, and you're really concentrating, you're going to have this really low level of blood sugar level. Your body is suddenly going to pick up on that and say, I've got to have something. So you eat something sugary to bring the level of your sugar back up. And then what happens after that is we get another crash. So unfortunately, we then actually feel absolutely exhausted when we're down at the bottom in that crash. And it makes us, because our blood sugar levels can actually go way below where they need to be, is it makes us then search for food again as well. So we want to try and keep these things stable. So the last bit I'm just going to cover, because I'm conscious of time, is different nutrients in our food will also have different effects on how full we feel. So proteins are the most satiating. They make us feel full. Carbohydrates do actually make us feel full, but it depends on what type. So the higher they are in fiber, the greater the satiety feeling of fullness that they have. There's 2 reasons for that. And one of the reasons is because it absorbs fluid, but creates this fullness in your stomach. So your stretch receptors in your stomach feed back to your brain and say, I'm full. And then fats have the least satiating effect. It's very easy for us to eat fat very quickly, but it does have a satiating effect when it's within a meal, like with protein as an example. And Charlie, as you said, the time it takes for us to eat will depend on how or when we feel that feedback loop of actually I'm full.
Really clear about not eating and drinking at the same time. So to do one or the other, but not to drink while you're eating.
For what reason? So what's the question in relation to, or what?
They just said that you just get the amount of food in your stomach as one thing and drink separately. And I can't remember where I either read this or heard it. And I couldn't get my head around that. And I didn't know if there was any studies to say don't eat and drink at the same time because it changes the way your body absorbs the food.
So it depends on where that comes from. So fluids can move through your system more quickly. So that's number one. So are they trying to liken something towards actually if we have fluid with our food, it will cause greater gastric emptying, which means we absorb the food quicker? Maybe, I don't know. When you have fluid with food, it causes greater satiety. So it makes you feel fuller because of the feedback loop from your stretch receptors in your stomach. And that's why, from a dieting principle, you often hear people say drink before you eat so that you feel full. So there is that fullness aspect to it. I imagine they might be linking some studies and making some sort of bridge that maybe isn't necessarily there. So like I say, what I want you to go away and do today is have a look at your food diary, have a look, use the hunger and fullness scale, see if you can recognize some patterns, see if you can change the way that you eat a little bit to start eating when you are hungry and stop eating when you are full. If you can't stop eating when you're full, at least eat being in the present moment of, I know that I'm full, but I'm really enjoying it and I'm going to continue to eat. Because actually, the more that we understand our hunger and fullness, the greater we are to be able to be in control or be in the driving seat of that, and try and keep our energy levels stable throughout the day. So there's quite a few other bits. So I would like you to write down at least 2 or maybe 3 things that you might think that you might be able to change from today, in line with maybe what you saw in your patterns in your food diary. So if you just all want to just write down a couple of things before the end, that would be great.
Claire, can I just ask you separately, are you a proponent of intermittent fasting?
Is what, sorry? Something about intermittent?
Are you a proponent of intermittent fasting?
So in terms of intermittent fasting, so there are benefits to it, certainly. It's really individual and personalized as to how we respond to it. We also don't know enough about it. There is not actually enough evidence out there. People are talking about it as if we know everything. We absolutely don't. We don't know whether 12 hours is better than 8 hours from a health perspective. We also need to be thinking about what is it that you're trying to achieve when you're intermittent fasting, because right now all the evidence is like amalgamated and the message is really messy about what does intermittent fasting mean. So you might be thinking about it from a weight control perspective, a health perspective, energy, because some people feel when they don't eat for longer periods of time they actually feel better, but is that because their energy level wasn't controlled properly before? So in terms of intermittent fasting, the basics of it is that we need a long enough fast overnight. If you're not going to do anything else, if you prioritize sleep and not eating a large amount of food late in the evening, or over 50% of your energy intake late in the evening, you've already made a start to intermittent fasting, because that essentially is intermittent fasting. That is the original intermittent fasting. It's just our lives, our days now are so long and people are eating for 14 hours, 12 to 14 hours. So I think we've still got a way to go in terms of intermittent fasting. But if you find it useful, we do know that in terms of some of our hormones in our system, and the way that our blood fats come back down into normal range, the way that our cells regenerate. We do know that fasting is important, but we also know that fasting is important from that perspective because of what we've been doing for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years overnight. So yeah, it really personalized, because for some people it causes them to overeat. So if you then overeat for another 5 days after having 2 days of fasting, is it worth it? Probably not. You're actually undoing what you've just tried to establish. So I'm actually not against, not against it, but I think we've got to find a way to work with it.
The other benefit of that approach to intermittent fasting, by essentially eating your evening meal earlier and your breakfast maybe a little bit later, because so therefore naturally you've got something like a 15-hour fast anyway, is so the data from my Oura ring would tell me the quality of my sleep is way better when I eat 4 hours before sleeping. Soon as I eat closer to going to sleep, the quality of my sleep drops.
Yeah, and there are a number of reasons. So sleep isn't something we covered today, but like there are a number of reasons as to foods that actually enhance our sleep, foods that can be eaten closer to sleep and should be eaten closer to sleep, but also how far in advance you're eating, and also what does that meal look like, because all of those things for different reasons have an impact on sleep, and they can be positive and negative. And that's really great, because things like wearables means it's personable to us. If we can see if we can see some sort of pattern to it, then making a few changes is really useful.
You'll be pleased to know, Ken, the dark chocolate just before bedtime doesn't carry on.
There's some really interesting points around sleep and food, so we dive into that quite a lot. And I often I link back everything we do around nutrition back to our sleep and the impact that it has on it, whether it's negative or positive as well. So I hope that's been useful. And if anyone has any questions afterwards, then please feel free to get in touch with me. And I'll find out on our little group as well, and next week, how you've all been getting on, just for a little bit of accountability.
Brilliant. Now that was really useful. Thank you, Claire. And I'm obviously I've been through the food diary with you before, but the application of the hunger scale on top of that, I thought was really interesting. So I'm definitely going to be doing that, and also not going back for seconds quite as often at dinner. That seems like a good strategy. But no, that was really, really good. We'll create a recording. We'll get the recording shared with the rest of the group that haven't dialed in today, and obviously get it uploaded into the portal in due course. Thank you for doing that. It's really interesting. Anybody else got any
worries?
Thank you.
No, everybody wants to go and have lunch now. You see, if you haven't had, you're probably starving. Now it's finished. everyone's hungry.
Flatten the glucose curve.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah,
Thank you.
right now, some people's glucose is right down here, though. That's the problem.
That was amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.
No worries.
Guys.